Okay, great. So hello. We are here doing a calc catch up with Sarah Hammond. I'm really excited to do this. Sarah was unable to join us at our calc catch up in September, but really has generously agreed to join us to do this extra special bonus calc catch up. And I'm really excited to talk with Sarah. So thank you very much, Sarah. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, and a little bit about your talk, because it was at CALC 2020.
Yeah, sure. So I work at the Squire Law Library in Cambridge, I've worked here since I did my talk last time, so not much has changed. There, I'm mostly I'm a library assistant, but mostly cataloguing, classification, inquiries, that kind of thing. And my talk was about our in-house classification scheme, and sort of using that as a lens to discuss wider classification issues about both sort of practical and political things, so like countries and jurisdiction and what topics are considered in which areas.
Great, yeah. So when we talked to Ramona as part of our calc catch up, she's obviously doing a lot of work around anti-racism in critical appraisal, and she mentioned as well about the challenge of encountering subject headings that are sort of inappropriate. So I said at the time it would have been awesome to have you there, so we could kind of bring you into that conversation as well. And it seems like there's sort of an increasing awareness among people that do cataloguing and classification about the kind of language that is used in those schemes. So I was kind of wondering what you thought about that, and if it has impacted on your work at all, and particularly because you've got a custom classification scheme, and you talked a little bit about the difficulties in changing that. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, the big classification, cataloging, subject heading discussion that is always going on is about the Library of Congress illegal aliens heading. And that has been changed by the Library of Congress, but not to not in a way that I think a lot of institutions are happy with. So we had already had sort of a big Cambridge university-wide institutional discussion about what to do, and it was decided that we would change it in the discovery side of, so we use Alma and Ex Libris project. So in the Primo discovery side, that it would display differently. And I think we've decided to keep that even with the new subject heading, because it still didn't reflect a lot of the problems that we had with the original one. And it didn't feel, I mean, politics aside, it didn't even feel like it was a direct replacement meaning wise, so that it wouldn't be effective anyway. And one that I come across cataloging a lot of law material was that we, in the Library of Congress subject heading, still had a primitive law subject heading for use, and it said, I think, for use in sort of indigenous and native law and customary law, but the main subject heading was still primitive law. And we've sort of phased that out of our classification scheme, which I'll probably talk about more later. But that has now actually, well, I raised it with someone at the main university library. They took it to the wider cataloguing geniuses that I don't
Yeah.
know how they work. And that has actually changed now at the Library of Congress level to customary law, which is not, again, I don't think it's quite a direct terminology swap, but it's a much less loaded and offensive term. So that's been really good, and it reflects more sort of how it's taught and discussed now. So that's been great. Yeah.
Thank you. So Calc 2020 took place in May 2020, which is 2.5 years ago now. So what have you been up to since then?
Um, Much the same. I mean, obviously, well, I've stayed in the same job, so that's been quite good to have some consistency throughout everything else. And I've also, well, it's hard to think where the time's gone. But in that
Yes.
time, I've done a whole postgrad diploma, and classification-wise made some changes that I think we'll come to later. But we also had a visit from some colleagues from Italy, from an institution that use a slightly updated version of our in-house scheme, and they're the only other people who have a similar one, and they are reclassifying. So they came over as part of a wider research trip, I think, and we had a big classification day. So that was really
Oh,
good.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So have they did they translate your scheme into Italian, or were they using it in English?
They're using it in English, so I think it's the European University Institute in Florence.
Hmm.
So I think they teach a lot in English. It's like a multilingual university, I think. But it's that the person who wrote our in-house scheme then left here and went there and wrote their
Ah.
law collections, like a new version. I
Hmm.
mean, it's still from like the 70s, and I've got a copy here. Still 1981, but slightly newer. Um, but they are reclassed. That's so where we're a separate law library, with theirs is like the law collections within the wider library. So they are reclassifying to Dewey to fit in with the rest of the library.
Hmm.
But they were sort of wondering how we've adapted it and what changes, like, what we've mapped onto what terms and that kind of thing as they go through that process.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think I'd kind of love to be the person that originated that scheme and, you move to a new job and you're like, here, I'm just going to rewrite the scheme again for you. What a way
Yeah.
to leave your legacy in libraries, just leave people with a scheme that you wrote like a long time ago. Brilliant. So yeah, so at the time in May 2020, you were working from home as we were only kind of a couple of months into the pandemic response here in the UK. So are you still working from home, and what kind of impact did this have on your role, and what kind of things did you have to change or adapt? Did that visit from the Italians, was that in person or was it all online?
So I'll go in reverse order probably. The visit from the Italians was in person, which was really nice. So I had a couple of Zoom chats with their law librarian, and then they were over in the UK for sort of a wider, I think, sort of post-pandemic catch up with all of their UK suppliers and
Mm.
networks and stuff. So we sort of fitted into that, which was again nice because everything has been online for which is
Yes.
good, but it was nice to sort of have that in-person thing again. Um, I've been back in the office solidly for about 18 months, and then sort of in and out before that, based because we went through the sort of, lockdown closure open, lockdown closure open.
Mm.
So as that was going on, I was sort of home and back again, with that. So I mean, it's a long time ago, and this would have been when I did the calc talk the first time around, is that when I started working from home, I actually didn't take a classification scheme home because I can't catalog from home. So I thought I wouldn't need it. But then I actually had all this time to think about it. But I forgot to take, where it's a physical copy, I forgot to take the book home with me. And then the building was on lockdown, and you couldn't get anything. So I had to do a lot of it from memory. And it also meant when we were having problems, particularly as we were sort of phasing back to in person, and some people were in the building, some people weren't in the building. We were doing like very limited click and collect kind of services. If there were any problems, it was so much harder to check because we have our sort of online catalog obviously, but all of our classification is offline. So
Mm.
sort of troubleshooting and problem solving was really hard, and a lot of it was guesswork, and sort of temporary lots of temporary class marks while maybe I wasn't in the building and there was something that really needed urgent cataloguing. So yeah, but yeah, no, I've been back on site for a long time, and really the big change is just that there's now more, where our sort of library services have changed a little bit. I have slightly less time to sort of do thinking.
Mhm.
So things haven't maybe gone as quick. I think probably in May 2020, I was super optimistic about, you know, what I would achieve, and that hasn't really been the case. But no, I think we're sort of moving out of, I don't know, well, we're into a new term and it feels much like it, the first time it's felt like pre 2020
Mm.
numbers and services and that kind of thing. So I'm thinking, yeah.
So that whole experience didn't make you and your library go, man, we need to junk this whole scheme and go to something like Dewey.
Well, I think the problem is that it's always been this scheme,
Mm.
as far as I know. Since it's had a scheme, it's been this scheme. So it would be such a massive piece of work. And we're not an anomaly in Cambridge by having our own classification scheme, or like a version of, there's lots of different versions of Dewey floating around. So it's not that we stand out as having, you know, stuck in an old one. And I think it is really, the main thing is that it would just be impossible time wise to do any sort of major project.
Yeah, I always find it interesting as someone that never attended and has never worked at Oxford or Cambridge. There's all these kind of little quirks that everyone's just kind of like treats as normal, and it's only like when you're an outsider and you kind of go, I'm sorry, you do what? And everyone's like, yeah, no, of course we all, you know, dress up in robes and go for lunch together. Don't you do that at your university? Like,
No,
no, we don't actually. But yeah,
no,
it must make it interesting to work there.
it is. It's still like so I've been in Cambridge for 5 years now, and it's still, I'd say on like a weekly basis, there's still something that I'm like, and why and why does that happen like that? And the answer is Cambridge. That's
Mm.
that's usually the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I had the privilege in 2020 actually to come to the Cambridge Libraries Conference, and that was really lovely. And just getting to kind of experience that, I stayed in one of the colleges and went to breakfast at one of the colleges, and then we had dinner at one of the colleges and stuff. And I was like, you know, this is nice as a special treat. I'm not sure I could do it every day, but this was really lovely
No.
to experience. So
Yeah, that was in our building. So
okay,
we
yeah.
were, 2 floors below the infamous classification scheme.
If only I'd known, I could have
Yeah.
come and visited it. I could have touched one of your paper copies. Okay, so moving on. So you mentioned you recently completed your degree in Library and Information Services Management, so congratulations.
Thank you.
What did you learn from this and how has it impacted on your work?
Um, well, I guess like a major part has been having a slightly better understanding of how um, professional work is supposed to happen. Because even if that's not how I would go about it or want to go about it, when you want to make changes, it's useful to know, how to go about them in a way that might get approval. So we did a lot about sort of strategy and change and management, and I didn't find it very interesting, but it's actually the kind of things that stick when you think, oh, I want to make this change, and I can't just do it because I'm not allowed. But feeling sort of better equipped to navigate like professional spaces, which is the worst thing I've ever said. And it was useful, I think, so I'd avoided a lot of the sort of information theory, because I know kind of, I think when you know what you think about things and that you've read other sides and you don't need to think anymore, it's actually quite useful to understand maybe why you think about things that way, or how sort of, the original point of classification and those kind of things. So when you're making changes or working with things now, you're not sort of destroying the original intention. Yeah.
And was there a reason you chose the course with management in the title? Because when I did my degree there, it was just librarianship. So we had to do one management module and that was it. But the title of
Yeah.
your degree sounds a bit more like you did a lot more management-y stuff.
I think we did one management module.
Okay.
I think it's how they differentiate between the in-person course and the distance learning course. So at Sheffield, the in-person course is the librarianship masters, and then the distance course, whether you do like the year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever sort of level of postgrad, is library and information services management. And I think it's that the modules are really, a lot of the modules are exactly the same, but I think it's more that's the in-person sort of full-time one is aimed at people who are earlier in their careers. So I think this one is supposed to sound more professional. And
Okay.
fit better with people who already have sort of established jobs and intentions and those kind of things. But the modules were almost exactly the same.
Okay, that makes sense. So thinking about cataloguing and classification, it's generally not taught on librarianship programs in the UK now. I think maybe UCL might be the exception to that. So did you do anything about cataloguing and classification on the degree? And what are your thoughts about it being part of library programs?
In terms of being part of library programs, I think it's important to do, because as far as I know, every library has some element of both of those. So even if you're not, I know some libraries now, their cataloging is sort of not outsourced, but they just use the publisher MARC records, and because they don't have in-house catalogers. But if you understand how the records work, at least you can sort of, I think it helps you to find things if you know sort of how the records work with the discovery side and what the different fields mean. And so you can, change things if they're wrong. We didn't have a specific cataloging or classification module, but we'd had one called information organization, which sort of covered both and looked at it in context with other things. So we looked at all these different types of organization and classification. So we did archive organization and how they're all different or related to each other, and we did sort of thesauruses and thesauri and some cataloging in that. But I don't think it's the best way to learn cataloging, because I think it's hard to learn without any purpose. If you don't have things that need, like, it's a hard thing to learn in theory. So I think it's a lot easier to learn through doing it. And also, I think a lot of institutions and libraries have got their own version of, their own standards of the standards. So I think sometimes it can be what I learned from other people telling me, oh, here we do it this, you learn from doing it and doing it and doing it. And rather than reading about what the different fields are.
Mm.
So yeah, and I'd say it cropped up in a lot of the other modules as well. So I know the subject headings, Library of Congress stuff came up quite a lot in other modules when we were talking about sort of inclusivity and diversity in libraries and free speech and that kind of thing. And same with, you know, I remember we talked a lot about Dewey and Dewey as a person and his legacy and whether that impacted or should impact how we use and advertise the scheme now. So that was interesting. So yes and no, I think is the answer.
Yeah, I think like for me, I've never personally been interested in cataloging and classification. I knew sort of fairly early on that that wasn't going to be the area of librarianship that I went into. And in my first job as a subject librarian, I had a colleague who was very into it, and he did me like this spiral bound little training guide almost to cataloging, which I still have. I don't have to use it, but yeah, and I found that really useful. And you're absolutely right. Like doing it is the way to learn cataloging, and classification I've never really got a grasp of at all. I get asked occasionally at work to classify something and I have a panic about it. I'm just like, no, don't ask me. I don't know anything. And I try and make one of my colleagues do it for me. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of those kind of core library skills, I guess, that you need in a lot of roles that aren't just in cataloging and classification. And a lot of libraries, like my library, doesn't have any catalogers, and that's why they give the classification work occasionally is passed up to the subject librarians, because we're supposed to know more about things. And I'm like, I don't know anything about anything. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd say like 80% of classification is looking up what the book is about, because I read the title and I think I don't know what this is. Like, I don't know what that term means.
Mm.
So and it is, like you said, it's really scary. Like, especially when I started doing it here, I was like, each book I was like, but what if it's wrong? They were like, well, it's not wrong, is it? Because if what's in the book matches what's on the catalogue, it's not wrong. That's where the book will be.
Mm.
You know, picking a class mark isn't like life or death.
That's a good way to think of it. Yeah.
It's
Yes.
only books.
Yeah. Yeah. I think because I've got subjects like aerospace engineering where I'm like, don't know what that is. If I get a book about that, it's like I don't know what any of these words are. But you're absolutely right. It is just a book, and the important thing is it's out there in the library rather than just sitting on my desk for ages, because I don't like doing classification.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason my background's blurred. Let's leave it at that.
Okay, yeah, let's move on. Um, so in your talk, you talked a little bit about it being a political decision whether to include things in classification schemes or not, with the example of Palestine, and the impossibility of neutrality when classifying items. So what are your thoughts on covering positionality in librarianship programs? And should they or are they be helping students understand and define their positions?
I think yes. I'd say I think we didn't cover it in terms of necessarily positionality in my course, but we did talk a lot about sort of where we're coming from as individuals and how that might not match up with our library users or our colleagues or other people, and sort of how to navigate that. So I think it comes up a lot with the sort of neutrality thing, is that it's very easy to think that because no one in the library is actively doing anything horrible, that we are then sort of this like really nice neutral place, whereas actually if everyone on your staff is, well, I know at Cambridge nearly everyone is white everywhere, um, and say in our library we're all white, most people are, I think, sort of, I'm the only person I think under 30, and a lot of people are sort of older, and that's great, but I think it does, in terms of positionality, is that what our library users look like? No. So we have a very young, being a university library, very young adult library user demographic, and they very international and very diverse. So even if we think that we're, by not doing anything, that we are being welcoming, I don't think that's the case. And being aware of that, when you do displays, or so I know we've done LGBTQ History Month displays, and then there's been things that I or another colleague think would be really good on it, but then we think, but do they, not everyone looking at the display knows who's made the display, and that things might read differently depending on who's chosen to put it there and who's looking at it. So yeah, I think it's a really big and important thing to be thinking about all the time.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, the need for the profession to diversify. And as white people, we can work hard on our understanding of lots of different issues and try and be anti-racist and allies, accomplices to LGBT people, etc. And maybe we are those people in some cases, but we're always only coming from one particular perspective. And we can try and understand other perspectives, but we need to work more to get those perspectives into libraries, I think.
Yeah.
And I think what you were saying about the cataloguing is sort of on the job training as well, I think really intersects with that as well, because you can have these conversations on your course, but if your work environment is one that's very sort of conservative, or it has a particular position, and then you're trained in that particular position, and you don't have those conversations at work as well, then you are sort of perpetuating what has already gone on. It sounds like at your workplace you do have those conversations to some extent. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't say we all agree on everything,
Mm.
but we do talk about things, especially sort of, well, we're always talking about like current events, and then so I think that's good to be aware of what's going on in the world that might be affecting our students and library users, outside of the building, outside of their courses. So like having some awareness of what's going on um, in the world, and locally. But also, I'd say like the institution has sort of, especially within the libraries, there is a lot of willing and intent to do better in terms of like being diverse and inclusive and welcoming. And that doesn't mean that it's happening necessarily, but I think there are a lot of conversations happening and people are very willing to talk about it.
Mm.
And there's a lot of intent and, not enthusiasm, but I don't know what the right word is, that people want to make things better.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think I have to say, like, everybody that I know that works at Cambridge does seem to have that kind of mindset. And I think that's a real kind of good step in the right direction of just even having people that think that way and are willing to have conversations and have intentions. And just sort of thinking about drawing a parallel with your classification schema here as well. So you mentioned that it is, you mentioned the sort of challenge of institutional history when wanting to make changes in the classification scheme. And I think, you know, institutional history, and you've got a lot more than what my place of work has in terms of institutional history, but you are almost battling against institutional history in making any changes to libraries at a place like Cambridge, I would imagine, versus, you know, at other institutions it might just be a little bit easier. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, and about sort of the challenges of institutional history with your classification scheme as well?
Yeah, also with the classification scheme, I think because it's just the law library, and as far as I know, it's not always been in this building, but it's always been sort of meshed with the faculty's like office and teaching spaces. It's like quite a mark of like, it's like a unique thing that it's got its own scheme that was written by the librarian for the collections, and that's like quite a point of pride. So to abandon it completely, or, you know, I think it would have to be really justified, and that it wouldn't just be like, I mean, it wouldn't be my decision, but it wouldn't just be the library's decision, it would go through the faculty as well, because we're sort of part of them and then part of the library network. So any big changes are sort of three-pronged approval, I think. And especially even just things like opening hours, like we have to go every way on making sure that it fits in with everyone and that everyone knows what we're doing. So I think that that can be a real thing, especially, well, I know this is upcoming at Cambridge, and it's in the recent university Legacies of Enslavement report, is that a lot of libraries are very attached to their name, and just like names are important, and if something's been known by one name for a very long time, then obviously it sort of becomes, I mean, you don't say, a lot of people wouldn't say like the department library, they'll just say the name of whoever's name is the library. But I know, so some of them I know are linked into the Legacies of Enslavement inquiry, so there's discussions, I think, about what to do with those and whether to change the names or acknowledge the names, or sort of how to go about that. And I think, I know all of this is public, I'm not like you know, spitting out.
Not telling
I know the
secrets.
university library have got one of their big sort of funds that they purchase books from was originally, I think, originally donated by someone who profited off of slavery. So there's a statement on their website now acknowledging that and sort of addressing that. And it's those kinds of things, I think. I mean, they're going to be prominent at places like Oxford and Cambridge, but a lot of other universities are really old, or are really are funded by families whose inheritances are linked back to things like slavery. So I know that wasn't really the question, but I think it all sort of, you can't untangle it all. So it's all in there in the history. So if you change something, that doesn't necessarily, there's no point changing something if you're not going to do anything active about the legacy of it. Right? You can't just, I don't think there's not much point changing the name of a library without saying why you're changing the name of a library, and doing, you know, if you're going to change it, what are you going to change it to that in 200 years isn't another point of problematism, like another
Yeah.
problem. I think it's a really tricky thing, and I think especially in universities, the libraries don't have sort of the ultimate authority, and everything has to go through funding and strategy and management and, you know, be a financially beneficial proposal for it to be a popular one. So that was kind of what I meant by institutional history as well, is that just the way that the institutions work often prevent like lower level changes being made.
Yeah. Yeah, thinking of that actually, you mentioned faculty sort of involvement in the library. When you make changes to the classification scheme, does it have to go through an approval process that involves faculty? So say, my next question was going to be about the impact of Brexit and jurisdictions, changing jurisdictions on your classification scheme. So, for example, you know, if you've had to take Britain out from under EU law, is that the kind of thing that you'd have to run it by the faculty, or do you have that kind of level of independence to be able to make adjustments to the classification scheme without asking them?
Yeah. So in terms of like those sort of changes, we just do it. It's the sort of thing I'll discuss with with the librarian and my line managers and stuff before we do it. And what is more, I'd say more than them needing to approve it, is that a lot of them have a lot of knowledge, and that's quite useful. So we have sort of consulted with them on various things to say, we're thinking of doing this. Does that line up with, you know, how it is? Or is there maybe something that we're missing because we don't understand the like tricky law stuff, and that it seems wrong to us, but actually it is correct. So it's been quite good that that expertise is there to draw on without us necessarily having to like try and become experts on it to make the decision. Brexit actually, well, one of the benefits of an older classification scheme that hasn't been updated is that it predates the European Union. So yeah, so we England, Wales, United Kingdom are all separate from the European countries. So then we've added, I think at the time there was the European Economic Area, which that's become where all the EU law stuff goes, but all the individual countries and the UK have all still got their separate jurisdictions that we do use. So the only thing has been trying to work out where to put things that are specifically about Brexit. But in terms of like jurisdictions and stuff, it's really not been too much of a problem at all, which has been really nice and a very tiny silver lining.
Yeah, definitely. What do you do though when new European countries are added, or like North Macedonia changed their name, didn't they? From Macedonia, they went from
Yeah.
Macedonia to North Macedonia. What's kind of the process for doing that?
I had a picture of this I've got a picture of it up, but I don't think I can drag it over. What I've got at the moment is this. That's not going to work, is it?
No,
No,
it's blurred.
it's handwritten annotations in pencil onto the original list. But what I also am currently working on is that I've printed out. I'm doing it's going to take forever, but I'm trying to sort of cross-reference what's in the classification scheme with what's on the catalogue, because that doesn't match up for some countries. Some of the newer ones where obviously one person has written one thing and someone else has written something else. So I'm trying to cross-reference that against a list of all the countries in the world. So, and try and figure out where the gaps are and what could be done alphabetically, but also then where do things fit, because it's alphabetical but not by country. So
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
if there's countries that aren't on the list, where do they fit in with the rest of the countries, if that makes sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was I watching back your talk, your original talk, what really intrigued me was this idea of like these paper copies that you have of the classification scheme. And I'm just very intrigued by like, how does that work? So you mentioned about having to cross-reference like your printed scheme against the catalogue and making annotations. So when someone does that, do they then have to go around to everybody else that's got a copy of this scheme and say, okay, we're now annotating, you know, we've crossed out Macedonia and put in North Macedonia instead. Can you make sure that's in your book as well? Or like, how does that kind of process work?
So, well, since the start of the pandemic, I have been the only one doing any classification. So the easy answer is that I don't need to tell anyone because unless it's a change that like an actual change, but in terms of updating country names and that kind of thing, it really doesn't affect. There's only, I think we've only got 3 or 4 printed copies and I'm the only one that actually uses it regularly. But what I am trying to type it up, this is part of my country's thing, is I'm trying to type up a version of how it's actually used. So changing some of the terminology to what we actually would call it now. And that's not necessarily like because something's offensive, it's just that terms change. And so we don't have environmental law in the printed scheme because they didn't use the term environmental law apparently when they wrote the scheme. So trying to type a version up that is editable and shareable so that we can all switch to using that. And then if I leave or someone else starts also doing cataloging and classification, it's sort of one central updated version. And also then you can search, which would be really good.
Mm.
Because at the moment, you're limited to what's in the subject index. And then if, you know, trying to work out what term is equivalent to what is used in the book and that kind of thing. So yeah, at the moment it's not being kept up to date all over the place because no one else uses them, but I am working on it because I do think, you know, I was lucky when I started that I overlapped with someone who had overlapped with the person before, so a lot of it had passed on. But I think if I left or someone new started, there wouldn't be that like handover of knowledge. So I know there'll be a lot of annotations that made absolutely no sense without that they only make sense to me because someone explained them to me. So yeah, I do think it's a massive problem. So that is also on the to-do list.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, in terms of, you know, sort of passing it on, at the moment, it seems like it really relies on institutional memory. And like you were saying, you know, you had that overlap with someone that came before and they had that overlap with someone that came before that. But yeah, it sounds, it sounds like, you know, if you suddenly left tomorrow for whatever reason, you know, it would all slightly fall apart because, you know, someone would need to try and make sense of what was happening. And yeah, I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and I know that I would hate it if it was the other way around and I started somewhere and well, when I started here, the person who had my job before me, there'd been an 18-month gap. But I crossed over with someone who does some of our like rare books and donations cataloging, who had like picked stuff up from the person before to then pass on to me. But there's just such a huge wealth of knowledge in people that
Mm,
isn't documented. I think this is every, you know, someone retires or isn't in when you want to ask them a question and then you think they're the person that knows all of this.
mm,
And what do we do when they're not here? Or how do you, some things are very difficult to like document or write down. So I think we could all do, when I say we, I mean universities could do a lot better job at recognizing their people.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think, I had this conversation on Twitter a little while ago about, for an information profession, we're really bad at sort of keeping records and passing on knowledge and information. And, I was sort of saying, anytime someone quits their job, the manager should be making them write like a huge, that should be like their main task before they leave, should be writing like a huge handover document of like, these are all the things I know, because some of the things that they know they might be the only person that knows that. So, and like in my role, I only have to give 4 weeks notice, and in 4 weeks, a fair amount of my job would probably happen, but there's parts of the year where different things happen, so you need to try and remember all of those different things, and particularly in a liaison type role, the people that you contact, and what times of year and who knows what about certain things going on in the university, all of that is so important, and it makes it really difficult for the person coming after you if you don't write any of that down and pass that along, because they're basically having to start from scratch. And I can imagine it's even like for a liaison role, like a lot of stuff, if you've done a liaison role before, you can probably pick it up reasonably quickly. But with a custom classification scheme, if you don't have that kind of handover,
Yeah.
it would be like, I guess, trying to learn a new language without any context for that language.
Yes. And I mean, even now there's bits of it that I know really well because it's where we get a lot of material for and that is used a lot. Then every now and then something comes up and I think, what
Yeah.
is that? Or what do we do with that? It's really, there's so much, and I needed someone when I started to tell me, well, they did, all the things that are not obvious from what is written down. So this says that, it says this, but actually in practice, we don't use that one, or we use this for that, and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, and things like knowing who to ask about certain things and who is receptive to being, like, I know from having been here for nearly 4 years now, or I guess 3.5 years, who in the faculty likes to be involved in the library and who like really appreciates being asked questions about their subject area and who is really too busy and would rather not
Mm.
be getting emails about from someone who doesn't know anything saying, oh, have you got a minute? So, and that's the kind of thing that is probably really useful when you start a job to know that, because then you think, it's not that you're doing something wrong, it's just that the institution doesn't work like that and no one thought to tell you.
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah, I just to pick up on that kind of collaborative aspect as well, I think that's probably one of the nice things about having your custom scheme is being able to go and ask people who are subject experts to have that kind of collaborative aspect to it. Whereas with Dewey, I mean, I'm sure someone somewhere is in charge of it and gets that kind of input. I don't know anything about it, but like with yours, it's almost, I guess, a bit more flexible, because as and when things come up, you have that more of that flexibility to get that advice and change it a bit more quickly. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, and it's just really helpful if you have a book that you don't know what to do with, which is so say that it's maybe been requested by a member of faculty that we buy it, being able to email them and say, the book's arrived, like where would you expect to find it in the library, because I'm having trouble sort of working out where it should go.
Mm.
And they will probably already know where they would think that it, like what sort of area of law it falls under, and it can sort of save some of the deliberation. And I've had people before say, oh, I picked this book up upstairs, but I've read it and now I actually think that maybe it should be somewhere else. And that's, I would never read the book to work that out. So
Yes.
that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And it means that sometimes if there's like slightly bigger changes, that it's good to have the backing. So we changed I think I mentioned earlier that there used to be a primitive law section that matched the subject heading, and then that had sort of faded out of use quite a while ago, I think. But the books are still there and have the class mark. It's just that no one knows what that class mark means, because I think it stopped being used because people found it outdated and offensive, but didn't know what to do with it. So it's just, the books have stayed there and it's not been added to. And then, so we did make some progress with that about 18 months ago, and it was really useful to actually talk to people in the faculty who know the history and have been here through the library moves and stuff, to say, you know, we're thinking of doing this. Does that sound right? Or, you know, does that fit with the purpose of that collection? Yeah. And also some of them donate us quite a lot of stuff, so that's nice.
Nice, yeah. And that kind of leads on to my next question as well, which is, so one of the questions you answered in 2020 was around users being able to find what they needed in a collection and whether that was enough, and sort of implying that perhaps we're overthinking classification schemes. And, you know, you just mentioned talking to the academic staff about where they would put books in a library, for example. So I was just wondering if your thoughts on this have developed or changed.
They have, I think, or they might have changed and then changed back, I'm not sure. But I would say I think everyone has found that over the last couple of years, sort of use of e-resources has absolutely like skyrocketed. So what I found now is that people who are using the shelves tend to be more people who are researching or doing a project. They're not looking for textbooks. They're not like first year undergrads looking for textbooks, because those are now all online. So they are looking and they want to browse and they want to look at the subject area and they want to spend some time on the shelves looking at books and stuff. So they're actually not necessarily finding a book on the catalogue and then trying to find the class mark. They actually do want to find the section on, I don't know, disarmament, and spend some time seeing what's on the shelf. So I think at the time of the talk, where sort of we were in the age of massive print textbook use, and that was the main thing, was people asking where to find, struggling to find textbooks and casebooks and their set reading material. I say there's a massive shift now, that's all online, is that people using the shelves want to browse and they want to, you know, use the physical resources in the classic way. So actually thinking a bit more about the classification really helps those people, because it means that they're probably more likely to find things by chance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think I've noticed that as well, or thought about this a little bit over the past couple of years. And the idea, like my library has an ebooks first policy, and I still try and buy print as and when I can, because I think you also have that element of serendipity, and people want to like go and look at some shelves and they think, you know, I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but if I look along some shelves, then something will catch my eye, or I'll be able to look at some things. And you don't really get that experience with ebooks, do you? And I've also found that for me, I don't think ebooks are as discoverable. Like for some reason, I don't know enough about it, but I like the metadata or the subject headings or how they're classified, whatever, don't seem to be as effective as print books. So I've looked for books on a subject that I know we have as ebooks, and they've not surfaced in a search in our discovery layer. And I'm like, oh, but I know we've got this specific title that's super relevant, but it's just not coming up. And yeah, I don't know if you have any insight into that.
I think I'm not sure I've got any insight. I think we have the same problem, and I think it is to do with the metadata, and that most when you use the ebook, it sort of pulls in the record, and that maybe isn't, those are maybe not catalogued in the same way as the print books are. The fields are all the same, but the information is slightly different. So they don't sort of index in the same way, or the things that you put in sort of out of practice of looking for a print book don't match up with what's in the ebook record, I think. But it is, like if you're browsing on the online catalogue, you'll find ebooks, and you don't get that on the shelf. I think we probably have so many things that we have bought as ebooks that people don't know are there because they like to use the shelves instead.
Brilliant. So was there anything else that I haven't covered that you'd like to pick up on, or anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I'm hoping this will be less painful to watch back than my first one was, because I tried to watch that yesterday, and I couldn't get through the first 5 minutes of my own voice. So
I think it's
hopefully
always
this
like
is good. And also thanks for having me, but also thank you for CALC, because I think it's been such like even before the pandemic, like such a needed space. And it's so nice to have such like a wide, I find a lot of other conferences and papers and stuff are quite narrow, and the range of topics has just been massive, and it's been really, really good.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying so. Yeah, we really try. We work hard on it. So thank you. And thank you so much again for not just being part of CALC 2020, but for agreeing to catch up with us. I think that's been really great, really great to chat with you. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get this video up in the next couple of weeks. And yeah, people will enjoy it as well.
Great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.